My husband took everything in our divorce: the mansion in Willowbrook Heights, the fleet of luxury cars, every account we'd built together over 12 years of marriage. He texted me from his lawyer's office. Maybe next time you'll think twice before refusing a prenup. Enjoy your fresh start at 38, sweetheart. What Derek didn't know, what his team of ruthless attorneys never discovered, was that in exactly 72 hours, I would inherit $1.3 billion from my great-aunt Cordelia's estate, and by the time he realized what he'd thrown away, it would be far too late. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. I stared at the final divorce decree in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Riverside, the only place I could afford after Derek's legal team had systematically stripped away every asset we'd accumulated during our marriage. The document bore his signature, bold, decisive strokes that seemed to celebrate his complete victory. The settlement terms were devastating. He retained our 7-bedroom estate, the vacation home in Seaside Cove, his collection of vintage Porsches, and every penny from our joint investment portfolio worth nearly $4 million. The irony was suffocating. 24 hours earlier, I had been Natasha Carmichael Westfield, wife of the renowned investment banker Derek Westfield, living in luxury in one of Millfield County's most exclusive neighborhoods. Now I was simply Natasha Carmichael again, sitting on a secondhand couch in a 400-square-foot apartment, holding a decree that legally declared me worth nothing. Derek's final text still glowed on my phone screen, each word dripping with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had executed the perfect financial maneuver. He had orchestrated this divorce with the same calculating precision he applied to his biggest deals, identifying assets, minimizing exposure, maximizing return. In his mind, I was simply another acquisition gone wrong, a liability to be efficiently discarded. What made his victory particularly cruel was how methodically he had planned it. For the past 18 months, while I believed we were working through a rough patch in our marriage, Derek had been systematically transferring assets into accounts I couldn't access, restructuring investments to minimize my legal claims, even relocating certain valuables to storage facilities registered under his mother's name. His lawyers had painted me as a gold digger who had contributed nothing substantial to our wealth accumulation, conveniently omitting that my family connections had secured him 3 of his most lucrative client relationships. The prenup he referenced in his text had been a point of bitter contention throughout our courtship. Derek's lawyers had presented it 3 weeks before our wedding, a document so one-sided it essentially guaranteed I would leave the marriage with whatever I had brought into it, which at the time was a modest trust fund worth about $200,000 and my grandmother's jewelry. I had refused to sign, not out of greed, but because the terms felt like a prediction of failure, a legal acknowledgement that our partnership was temporary. "If you truly love me, why do you need legal protection from me?" I had said during one of our heated arguments about the prenup. His response had been smooth, practiced. "It's not about love, Natasha. It's about being practical. My family has built this wealth over generations. We have to protect it." I had held firm, and eventually, Derek had relented. Or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that his surrender was tactical, not emotional. Without a prenup, he would simply need to be more creative in his eventual exit strategy. The apartment around me was a stark reminder of how complete his victory had been. The walls were bare. Derek had claimed all our art was purchased with his money. The kitchen contained basic items I'd bought at discount stores. He had retained our complete collection of professional-grade cookware and imported china. Even the clothes in my tiny closet were limited to items his legal team had deemed clearly personal, rather than marital luxuries. But as I sat there in my diminished circumstances, I felt something Derek would never understand: relief. Not relief at being poor. The financial stress was genuine and frightening. Relief at finally seeing him clearly without the romantic distortions that had clouded my judgment for over a decade. The man I had married was charming, ambitious, and undeniably handsome. He was also, I now realize, fundamentally incapable of viewing relationships as anything other than transactions. Every kindness had been calculated, every gesture of love measured against potential return on investment. Our marriage wasn't a partnership, it had been a hostile takeover executed so slowly I hadn't recognized it until the acquisition was complete. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Lydia. "How are you holding up? Do you need anything?" I appreciated her concern, but I couldn't bring myself to respond yet. How could I explain that while I was devastated by Derek's betrayal, I was also anticipating a reversal of fortune so dramatic it would make his current gloating look absurd? The inheritance from Great Aunt Cordelia had been completely unexpected. She was my grandmother's sister, a reclusive woman who made her fortune in early tech investments and real estate development. We had met only a handful of times during my childhood, usually at formal family gatherings where she appeared briefly, observed everything with sharp eyes, and departed without much conversation. I had always assumed her wealth would go to established charities or distant relatives who had maintained closer relationships. The call from her estate attorney had come just 6 days ago, in the middle of my divorce proceedings. "Miss Carmichael," the lawyer had said, "I'm calling to inform you that you are the primary beneficiary of Cordelia Ashworth's estate. The inheritance includes liquid assets, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios totaling approximately $1.3 billion. I had been sitting in my lawyer's office when the call came, listening to another discussion about how little I might salvage from my marriage. The number was so incomprehensible that I had asked him to repeat it twice. "Billion," he had confirmed, with a B. The timing was extraordinary. The estate had been in probate for nearly 2 years due to complex international holdings and legal challenges from other family members. Those challenges had finally been resolved, and the transfer would be completed within the week, 3 days after my divorce was scheduled to be finalized. Derek knew nothing about Great Aunt Cordelia or her wealth. During our marriage, I had rarely mentioned my extended family, partly because we had little contact, and partly because Derek showed minimal interest in anyone who couldn't advance his professional network. He had attended exactly one family gathering in 12 years, spending most of the evening on work calls. As I folded the divorce decree and placed it in the manila folder that now contained my entire legal existence, I felt a profound shift in perspective. Derek's text message, intended to inflict maximum psychological damage, would soon become the most ironic communication of his life. The woman he was mocking for her supposed financial helplessness was about to become one of the wealthiest individuals in the state. But unlike Derek, I understood that true power wasn't about accumulation. It was about discernment. And I was about to demonstrate the difference between someone who inherits wealth and someone who truly deserves it. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you. So if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. Before we dive deeper into how Derek's perfect plan was about to spectacularly backfire, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Are you tuning in from New York, California, maybe somewhere across the globe? We love hearing from our community around the world. And if this story of ultimate justice is already getting your heart racing, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because tomorrow we've got something absolutely mind-blowing lined up for you. I'm talking about a story that will make today's billion-dollar inheritance look like pocket change. Trust me, you won't want to miss what we have planned. Also, if you've ever felt underestimated or had someone try to write you off completely, this story is going to hit differently. Sometimes the people who think they know us best are the ones who know us least. And sometimes the universe has a way of delivering justice in the most unexpected packages. So, grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive into how one woman's worst day became the setup for the most satisfying reversal you've ever heard. Because what Derek was about to discover would change everything he thought he knew about power, wealth, and the woman he'd just thrown away. Derek's victory celebration was everything you'd expect from a man who believed he'd just executed the financial coup of a lifetime. That evening, as I sat in my cramped studio apartment eating takeout Chinese food from paper containers, he was hosting what he called a liberation dinner at Chateau Meridian, the most exclusive restaurant in Millfield County. According to the social media posts that Lydia forwarded to me, posts that I couldn't bear to look at directly, Derek had reserved the private dining room and invited his inner circle to toast his successful navigation of a complicated situation. The guest list read like a who's who of his professional network. His law partners from Whitmore and Associates, his closest clients from the investment banking world, and, of course, his mother, Patricia Westfield, who had never hidden her disdain for me during our marriage. She had always viewed me as an inadequate match for her precious son, someone who lacked the appropriate breeding for their social standing. She had probably been planning this celebration dinner since the day Derek filed for divorce. Through sources I still had in our old social circle, people who were horrified by Derek's behavior but too intimidated by his influence to speak out publicly, I learned the details of his triumphant evening. He had worn his most expensive suit, the custom-tailored Tom Ford that had cost more than most people's monthly salary. He had ordered their finest champagne, a 2008 Dom Perignon, that retailed for $800 per bottle, and throughout the meal, he had regaled his guests with strategic details of how he had protected the family assets from what he called an unfortunate miscalculation in partner selection. The most infuriating part wasn't his celebration itself, it was his narrative about our marriage and its dissolution. According to witnesses, Derek spent considerable time explaining to his dinner companions how he had learned valuable lessons in due diligence in personal relationships. He described our 12-year marriage as a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough background checks, as if I were a failed business venture rather than a woman who had loved him completely. He painted himself as the victim of elaborate deception, claiming that I had misrepresented my financial position during our courtship. This was particularly rich, considering that I had been entirely transparent about my modest trust fund and family background. What I hadn't done was provide him with a detailed genealogical analysis of every distant relative and their respective net worth. Information that, even if I had possessed it, would have been irrelevant to a genuine romantic relationship.
Derek's version of events positioned him as a financially savvy individual who had narrowly escaped a gold digger's trap. He conveniently omitted several crucial facts: that my family connections had directly led to 3 of his most lucrative client relationships, that I had contributed my own inheritance to the down payment on our Willowbrook Heights mansion, and that I had sacrificed my own promising career in art curation to support his demanding social and professional obligations. The narrative he constructed was masterful in its selective editing. Yes, I had come from a family with old money connections, but Derek described this as deliberate deception rather than the natural reserve that characterized my family's approach to wealth. We had never been flashy about money. My parents had raised me to view financial resources as tools for creating opportunities rather than symbols for displaying status. This discretion, which I had always considered a virtue, became evidence of duplicity in Derek's revisionist history. His guests, from what I understood, received this narrative with the appropriate mixture of sympathy and admiration. They praised his strategic thinking, his legal maneuvering, his ability to protect himself from someone who had supposedly taken advantage of his generous nature. The irony was suffocating. A room full of wealthy, sophisticated people congratulating a man for systematically destroying the woman who had devoted over a decade to supporting his ambitions. Derek's mother, Patricia, was apparently the most vocal in her approval. She had always believed that her son had married beneath his station, and the divorce proceedings had vindicated her years of subtle and not so subtle criticism of my background, my career choices, and my failure to provide the grandchildren she had demanded. That evening, she publicly congratulated Derek for his mature handling of a difficult situation and expressed her relief that he could now find a more suitable partner. The financial aspects of Derek's victory were particularly satisfying to him, according to multiple sources. He had retained not only our primary residence, a property worth approximately $2.8 million, but also our vacation home, investment portfolio, and luxury vehicles. His legal team had successfully argued that these assets represented the fruits of his labor and investment acumen, while my contributions were characterized as minimal and indirect. What made Derek's triumph even sweeter in his mind was the vindication of his family's long-held beliefs about the importance of financial compatibility in marriage. The Westfields had built their wealth over 3 generations through careful marriages, strategic investments, and an almost obsessive attention to protecting their accumulated assets. Derek's father had frequently lectured him about the dangers of emotional decision-making in relationship choices, advice that Derek now felt vindicated in following, albeit retrospectively. The evening's celebration extended well past midnight, with Derek and his companions moving to his private study in the Willowbrook Heights mansion, the home that had once been ours, but was now exclusively his. There, surrounded by the art collection we had curated together, but which legally belonged entirely to him, Derek held court like a conquering general, reviewing the spoils of war. His confidence was absolutely unshakable. He had outmaneuvered me legally, financially, and socially. He had protected his assets, maintained his reputation, and positioned himself perfectly for whatever came next in his personal life. In his mind, he had demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that made him successful in business, applied with equal effectiveness to his personal affairs. Derek believed he had won completely. He had calculated every angle, anticipated every potential challenge, and emerged victorious from what could have been a financially devastating divorce. His celebration that night wasn't just about the money he had retained. It was about the validation of his worldview, his methods, and his fundamental beliefs about how relationships and power operated. What Derek couldn't possibly have known as he raised his final glass of champagne in that celebration was that his perfect victory was about to become the setup for the most spectacular reversal of fortune in his family's 3-generation history. The woman he was toasting himself for discarding was 48 hours away from inheriting more money than his family had accumulated across decades of careful wealth management. But in that moment, Derek Westfield felt invincible. And that feeling of invincibility was about to make his fall infinitely more devastating. Derek's fundamental miscalculation wasn't just about money. It was about completely misunderstanding who I was and where I came from. Throughout our 12-year marriage, Derek had constructed an elaborate fiction about my background, one that served his ego and justified his condescending treatment of me. In Derek's mind, I was Natasha Carmichael, the grateful recipient of his financial generosity, a woman from modest means who had lucked into marrying above her station. The reality was far more complex, but Derek had never bothered to dig deeper than surface appearances. He knew I came from what he dismissively called old New England stock, but interpreted this as faded gentry rather than genuine wealth. When I mentioned family gatherings or distant relatives, his eyes would glaze over with the particular boredom of someone who considered such connections irrelevant to his world of aggressive wealth accumulation. What Derek never understood was that my family's approach to money was fundamentally different from his. The Carmichaels had never been flashy about wealth. We didn't name buildings after ourselves or throw lavish parties to display our assets. My great-grandfather had been a railroad baron, my grandfather a successful industrialist, and my father a respected federal judge. But our family's philosophy had always been discretion over display, substance over spectacle. My great-aunt Cordelia embodied this philosophy perfectly. Born in 1925, she had inherited a substantial fortune from her father's steel manufacturing empire. But instead of simply maintaining that wealth, she had transformed it into something extraordinary. While still in her 20s, Cordelia had recognized the potential of emerging technologies and had become one of the earliest investors in what would eventually become Silicon Valley. Her investments in companies that most people had never heard of in the 1960s and 1970s had grown into billion-dollar positions by the time she passed away. But Cordelia's true genius wasn't just in picking winning investments, it was in her ability to remain completely invisible while building an empire. She had learned early that being underestimated was a competitive advantage, especially for a woman operating in male-dominated financial circles. While men like Derek's father were busy making themselves the center of attention at charity galas and society events, Cordelia was quietly acquiring controlling interests in real estate developments, technology startups, and energy companies that would define the next century's economy. Derek had met Cordelia exactly twice during our marriage. The first encounter was at my grandmother's funeral, where she appeared briefly, offered quiet condolences, and departed without fanfare. Derek's assessment of that meeting was typical of his shallow observation skills. Seems like a sweet old lady, probably living on some modest pension. He couldn't have been more wrong if he had tried. The second meeting occurred at a family Christmas gathering about 8 years into our marriage. Cordelia, then in her late 80s, had sat quietly in the corner of my parents' living room, observing family dynamics with the sharp intelligence that had made her fortune. Derek, true to form, had spent most of the evening on work calls, treating the gathering as an inconvenience rather than an opportunity to understand the family he had married into. What Derek missed during that Christmas visit was Cordelia's detailed conversation with me about emerging markets in renewable energy. While he was outside arguing with his office about some minor crisis that couldn't wait after the holidays, Cordelia and I spent 2 hours discussing the investment potential of solar technology, wind farms, and battery storage systems. She was fascinated by my insights into art market trends and how they reflected broader economic patterns, knowledge I had developed during my brief but successful career in art curation, the career Derek had convinced me to abandon. That conversation with Cordelia had been one of the most intellectually stimulating experiences of my marriage, but when Derek returned from his calls, he barely acknowledged her presence. His dismissive attitude toward my family had always been a source of tension between us, but I had learned to navigate around his blind spots rather than confront them directly. Derek's underestimation of my family extended far beyond Cordelia. He had never bothered to research the Carmichael family history, never questioned why we owned property in 3 states despite my parents' seemingly modest lifestyle, never wondered why I received birthday cards from people with recognizable surnames in finance and politics. To Derek, these connections were irrelevant because they didn't translate into immediate social or professional advantage for him. The trust fund I had brought into our marriage was another perfect example of Derek's selective attention. He knew it existed. The $200,000 had helped with our wedding expenses and the down payment on our first apartment, but Derek had never questioned its origins or wondered whether it might be part of a larger family financial structure. He assumed it represented the entirety of my family's wealth, rather than what it actually was, a modest allowance designed to test my financial responsibility before larger inheritances might be considered.
Derek's law school education had taught him to research everything meticulously. But apparently, that diligence didn't extend to understanding his wife's background. He had never asked about the family investment accounts that generated my quarterly statements, never inquired about the purpose of my occasional trips to visit family lawyers in Boston, never wondered why certain relatives seemed to live far beyond what their stated professions should have supported. Most tellingly, Derek had completely misunderstood my decision to abandon my art curation career. He interpreted my willingness to step back from professional life as evidence that my career had been insignificant, a hobby, rather than a serious professional pursuit. What he didn't realize was that my position at the Riverside Museum of Fine Arts had been exceptionally prestigious for someone my age, and my resignation had been a genuine sacrifice made to support what I thought was our shared future. My expertise in art authentication and market analysis had actually been quite valuable, something Derek might have discovered if he had ever paid attention to the consulting work I continued to do privately. Several of my former colleagues regularly sought my opinion on acquisitions and valuations, consulting relationships that Derek dismissed as keeping busy, rather than recognize as ongoing professional engagement in a highly specialized field. The most profound misunderstanding, however, was Derek's assessment of my character. He had convinced himself that I was fundamentally passive, someone who would accept whatever terms he chose to impose. This interpretation was based on my decision to avoid conflict during our marriage, to find compromises rather than force confrontations. Derek mistook my preference for harmony as evidence of weakness, my diplomatic approach to disagreement as proof of intellectual inferiority. What Derek never grasped was that my family had taught me the difference between strategic patience and genuine submission. The Carmichaels had survived and thrived for generations, not through aggressive confrontation, but through careful observation, strategic positioning, and the ability to recognize when circumstances were shifting in our favor. These weren't the skills of the weak. They were the tools of families who understood that real power often operated quietly, almost invisibly. As I sat in my studio apartment that night, eating Chinese takeout and listening to Derek's celebration through secondhand reports, I couldn't help but marvel at how completely he had misread everything about me. The woman he thought he was discarding was actually the heir to a fortune that dwarfed his family's accumulated wealth. The passive wife he believed he had outmaneuvered was about to demonstrate exactly what strategic patience could accomplish. Derek had won the battle, but he had never understood what war he was actually fighting. The moment that shattered my illusions about Derek and our marriage happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in March, exactly 18 months before he filed for divorce. I had returned home early from a gallery opening in downtown Riverside, having developed a migraine from the combination of wine and overly aggressive air conditioning. The house was supposed to be empty. Derek had mentioned a client dinner that would keep him out until late. But as I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, I heard voices coming from his study. The first voice was unmistakably Derek's, but it carried a tone I had never heard before, calculating, almost predatory. The second voice belonged to his younger brother Cameron, who worked as a forensic accountant and had always struck me as the more ruthless of the Westfield siblings. Their conversation stopped me cold in the hallway outside Derek's study door. "The key is establishing a paper trail that shows minimal commingling of assets," Cameron was saying. "If you start moving things now, by the time you're ready to file, it'll look like standard investment restructuring rather than divorce preparation." Derek's response chilled me to the bone. How long do we have before she might catch on? With Natasha, years probably. She's never shown much interest in the detailed financials. Plus, she trusts you completely. That works in our favor. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they would hear it. They were discussing me like I was a problem to be solved, a liability to be managed. The casual cruelty in their voices, the assumption that I was too naive or disinterested to notice their manipulations, was devastating. Cameron continued outlining what was clearly a comprehensive strategy for asset protection in anticipation of divorce. The art collection is tricky because she has expertise there, but if you gradually rotate pieces into storage and claim they're on loan to museums or galleries, she probably won't notice immediately. The real estate holdings can be restructured through LLCs that predate the marriage. We'll need to create some backdated documentation, but that's manageable. What about the investment accounts? Derek asked. Transfer everything into vehicles that show you as the sole decision maker. Make it look like she was never involved in the actual management, just a beneficiary of your expertise. Her family money can stay separate. That actually helps our narrative that you were the wealth creator in the relationship. The conversation went on for another 20 minutes, covering every aspect of our shared life with the dispassionate efficiency of a business transaction. They discussed my weaknesses, my blind spots, my predictable reactions to various scenarios. Cameron had clearly studied me like a case study, identifying precisely how to manipulate my trust and use my own character traits against me. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the realization that this version of Derek, coldly calculating and utterly without empathy, was probably his authentic self. The loving husband who brought me coffee in bed, who remembered anniversaries and supported my career decisions, who seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, that man might have been entirely fabricated. As I stood in that hallway, struggling to process what I was hearing, Cameron made a comment that clarified the full scope of Derek's deception. The timing is actually perfect. The prenup refusal gives us a clear narrative about her intentions, and the fact that she's been out of the workforce for so long weakens her position considerably. Plus, her family's old money discretion means she probably doesn't even know the full extent of their wealth, so there won't be any surprises there. That last comment revealed something Derek had never told me directly. He had been researching my family's finances throughout our marriage. While I had been transparent about my background and modest trust fund, he had been conducting his own investigation, trying to determine whether there were hidden assets that might complicate his exit strategy. The fact that Cameron felt confident there would be no surprises suggested their research had been thorough but ultimately incomplete. After the brothers concluded their planning session and Cameron left through the front door, I remained frozen in the hallway for nearly an hour. When Derek finally emerged from his study, he found me sitting on our bed, still in my coat, staring at nothing. "You're home early," he said, his voice returning to the warm, concerned tone I had thought was genuine. "How is the gallery opening?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man I had loved for over a decade was expertly performing the role of caring husband while planning my systematic destruction. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "Fine," I managed to say, "just tired." He sat beside me, on the bed, placing what I now knew was a calculated hand on my shoulder. "You've been working too hard lately. Maybe you should take a break from the consulting work, focus on other things." The suggestion, which I might have interpreted as concern just hours earlier, now felt like manipulation. Derek wanted me further removed from professional networks, more dependent on him, easier to isolate when the time came for his legal assault. Over the following weeks, I began noticing things that had been invisible to me before. Derek's sudden interest in having me sign routine financial documents without reviewing them carefully. His encouragement for me to spend more time with hobbies and less time maintaining professional relationships. His subtle but persistent efforts to position himself as the financial decision-maker in our household. The most insidious part of his strategy was how he used my own values against me. Derek knew I believed in partnership, trust, and shared decision-making in marriage. He exploited these beliefs to gain my compliance with arrangements that were actually designed to disadvantage me. When he suggested consolidating our investments with his financial advisor for better coordination, I agreed because it seemed like smart joint planning. When he recommended that I step back from certain professional activities to focus on our life together, I interpreted it as romantic rather than strategic. But the conversation I'd overheard changed everything. I began to understand that Derek's timeline for divorce was longer than I had initially realized. This wasn't a sudden decision born of marital unhappiness. It was a methodical, multi-year project designed to ensure his complete financial victory when the relationship ended. The emotional impact was devastating, but it also clarified something crucial. Derek had underestimated me as profoundly as I had misunderstood him. His entire strategy was based on the assumption that I was passive, trusting, and financially naive. While the first two had largely been true, the third was a fundamental miscalculation that would ultimately destroy his perfect plan. That night, as Derek slept peacefully beside me, believing his secret was safe, I made a decision that would change both our futures forever. I wouldn't confront him. That would only force him to accelerate his timeline and become more careful about his planning. Instead, I would do something Derek couldn't anticipate because it was completely outside his understanding of who I was. I would wait, watch, and prepare for the moment when his carefully constructed strategy would collapse under the weight of information he couldn't possibly possess. The woman Derek thought he was systematically outmaneuvering was about to become someone entirely different. But unlike his deception, my transformation would be built on truth rather than manipulation, strength rather than exploitation. And when the time came, Derek would discover that the greatest mistake of his plan wasn't technical or legal. It was assuming that love and trust, once betrayed, couldn't be transformed into something far more dangerous: clarity, purpose, and the absolute determination to ensure that justice would be served. In the weeks following my devastating discovery of Derek's true intentions, I began what I would later recognize as the most important education of my life, learning to think like someone who had been systematically underestimated and was now planning to use that miscalculation to her advantage. The woman who had spent 12 years trying to be the perfect wife was about to become something Derek couldn't predict or control: a strategic opponent who understood both his weaknesses and her own hidden strengths. My first move was deceptively simple. I started paying attention. For years, I had allowed Derek to handle our financial affairs while I focused on what I thought were my responsibilities: managing our social calendar, maintaining our homes, supporting his career advancement. This division of labor had seemed natural, even progressive, since Derek genuinely enjoyed financial planning and I had other interests. Now I understood it had been a carefully orchestrated isolation technique designed to keep me ignorant of our true financial position. I began by requesting copies of all our financial statements, framing my sudden interest as a desire to be more involved in our family planning. Derek, still confident in his timeline and secure in his belief that I lacked both the knowledge and motivation to understand complex financial structures, was initially helpful. He explained various investment vehicles, walked me through our asset allocation, and even complimented my newfound maturity about money management. What Derek didn't realize was that I wasn't approaching these documents as a dutiful wife seeking education. I was studying them with the analytical skills I had developed during my art curation career. Authentication requires an eye for detail, an ability to spot inconsistencies, and most importantly, the patience to research provenance until you understand the complete story behind each piece. I applied these same skills to our financial records, and the patterns I discovered were both illuminating and infuriating. Derek had been systematically restructuring our assets for over 2 years, not the 18 months I had initially realized based on the conversation with Cameron. Bank statements showed a subtle but consistent pattern of transfers that moved joint assets into accounts where Derek was the sole signatory. Investment accounts that had once been titled in both our names had gradually been converted to individual accounts under various business justifications that I had approved without fully understanding their implications. The art collection was perhaps the most personally painful example of his methodical planning. Pieces we had acquired together, including several that I had specifically recommended based on my professional expertise, had been quietly moved to climate controlled storage facilities registered under Derek's business entities. When I casually asked about a particular painting that I noticed was missing from our living room, Derek explained that it was on loan to a museum exhibition, a lie that was both plausible and impossible for me to verify without extensive research. But my growing understanding of Derek's strategy also revealed something he hadn't anticipated: opportunities for my own counterplanning. Every technique he was using to isolate and diminish my position could potentially be turned against him, but only if I developed resources and knowledge that existed completely outside his awareness. I started with my family connections, relationships that Derek had always dismissed as socially irrelevant, but which I now recognized as potentially valuable in ways he couldn't comprehend. My cousin Jonathan worked as an estate planning attorney in Boston, specializing in high net worth family wealth management. During what appeared to be a casual family visit, I mentioned that Derek and I were interested in updating our estate planning documents and asked Jonathan for recommendations about the most current strategies for asset protection. The conversation that followed was revelatory. Jonathan, who had always been fond of me and had never particularly warmed to Derek, spent 3 hours explaining sophisticated wealth preservation techniques that went far beyond anything Derek had ever discussed with me. More importantly, he mentioned that our family had always used these strategies, suggesting that my understanding of our financial position might be more limited than I had realized. You know, Jonathan said carefully, given some of the changes in tax law and the complexity of multi-generational wealth transfer, it might be worth having a comprehensive review of all family financial relationships. Sometimes people are surprised by what they discover when they look at the complete picture. I filed this comment away for future consideration, but my immediate focus remained on understanding and documenting Derek's activities. I began making copies of every financial document that passed through our household, creating a secure archive and a safety deposit box that Derek knew nothing about. I photographed account statements, recorded serial numbers from valuable items in our home, and maintained detailed logs of Derek's explanations for various financial changes. This documentation process taught me something crucial about Derek's psychology. He was so confident in his intellectual superiority that he often provided more information than necessary when explaining his decisions. His need to be seen as the financial expert in our relationship made him vulnerable to what appeared to be admiring questions about his strategic thinking. I learned to ask the right questions to elicit detailed explanations of his methods, which I then carefully analyzed for weaknesses and opportunities. The safety deposit box became the foundation of what I began thinking of as my parallel infrastructure. In addition to financial documentation, I stored copies of personal documents, jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, and other items that Derek might attempt to claim as marital property. I also began maintaining a detailed journal, recording not just Derek's financial maneuvers, but also his statements about his intentions, his timeline, and his assessment of my capabilities and likely responses. 6 months after overhearing the conversation with Cameron, I made my most significant strategic move. I reconnected with my mentor from the art world, Dr. Evelyn Hartwell, who had directed the Riverside Museum during my tenure there. Evelyn had always believed that I had made a mistake in stepping back from my career, and she welcomed my renewed interest in the art market with enthusiasm that was both professionally validating and personally healing. Through Evelyn, I began taking on small consulting projects that Derek viewed as harmless social activities, but which actually provided me with several crucial advantages. First, they rebuilt my confidence in my professional capabilities, reminding me that I possessed expertise and judgment that existed completely independently of Derek's opinions. Second, they created income streams that Derek didn't monitor or control, giving me access to resources that were entirely my own. Most importantly, they reconnected me with a network of accomplished, independent women who could serve as both inspiration and practical support. Dr. Hartwell introduced me to several collectors and dealers who were interested in my authentication services, work that commanded substantial fees, but appeared to Derek as casual social engagement with art people. Within 6 months, I had generated over $40,000 in consulting income that Derek knew nothing about, money that I deposited in accounts he had never seen and couldn't access. But perhaps the most valuable outcome of my renewed professional engagement was the restoration of my confidence in my own judgment. For years, Derek's subtle but persistent undermining of my opinions and decisions had created a kind of learned helplessness that made me doubt my ability to navigate complex situations independently. Working with clients who respected my expertise and relied on my recommendations reminded me that Derek's assessment of my capabilities was both self-serving and fundamentally inaccurate. As I built this parallel infrastructure of documentation, resources, and relationships, I maintained the facade of the devoted wife with increasing skill. Derek's confidence in his strategy made him less observant rather than more, and his assumption that I was essentially passive meant that he interpreted my questions and new interests as evidence of personal growth rather than strategic preparation. By the first anniversary of my discovery of his true intentions, I created something Derek couldn't have imagined, a comprehensive understanding of his strategy combined with resources and relationships that existed completely outside his knowledge or control. I still didn't know how this preparation would ultimately be used. That would depend on timing and circumstances that remained uncertain. What I did know was that Derek's perfect plan was built on a foundation of assumptions about me that were becoming more inaccurate with each passing day. The passive, trusting, financially naive woman he thought he was outmaneuvering was methodically transforming herself into someone entirely different, a strategic thinker with hidden resources, detailed knowledge of his vulnerabilities, and, most importantly, the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to act. The acceleration of my counter-strategy began with an unexpected phone call on a crisp October morning, 14 months after I had discovered Derek's true intentions. I was reviewing authentication documents for a private collector when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize with a Boston area code. The voice on the other end belonged to Harrison Pembroke, senior partner at Pembroke Sterling and Associates, one of New England's most prestigious estate planning firms.
Mrs. Westfield, he said, his tone carrying the careful formality of someone delivering significant news. I'm calling regarding the estate of your great-aunt, Cordelia Ashworth. I understand this may come as a surprise, but you've been named as a beneficiary in her will. Could we arrange a meeting at your earliest convenience? The timing was extraordinary. Just as I was building my strategic foundation and preparing for whatever Derek might eventually attempt, the universe had presented an opportunity that would fundamentally alter the equation between us. I arranged to meet with Harrison the following week, telling Derek that I was visiting my parents in Millbrook, a lie that came surprisingly easily given how much practice I'd had in strategic misdirection over the past year. Harrison's offices occupied an entire floor of a historic building overlooking Boston Harbor, the kind of old money elegance that Derek aspired to but had never quite achieved. Harrison himself was exactly what I expected. Early 70s, silver-haired, with the quiet confidence that comes from managing generational wealth for families who measure their influence in centuries rather than decades. Your great-aunt was a remarkable woman, Harrison began, settling behind a mahogany desk that probably witnessed more financial history than most people could imagine. She followed your career with great interest,
particularly your work in art authentication and your marriage to someone in the financial sector. The implication that Cordelia had been monitoring my life was both touching and slightly unsettling. Harrison explained that she had been updating her will regularly, but the final version had been completed just 6 months before her death, suggesting that her decision to name me as primary beneficiary was recent and deliberate. The estate is complex, Harrison continued, sliding a thick folder across his desk, with holdings in real estate, technology investments, energy sector positions, and what I can only describe as an extraordinarily prescient portfolio of emerging market positions. The total value, after taxes and charitable bequests, is approximately $1.3 billion. Even though I had received advance notice of the inheritance amount, hearing it confirmed in Harrison's matter-of-fact tone was overwhelming. This wasn't lottery luck or windfall. It was the culmination of nearly a century of strategic investment decisions by a woman who understood market dynamics better than most professional fund managers. Harrison's next revelation was even more significant. Mrs. Ashworth left specific instructions regarding the timing of this inheritance. She was quite explicit that the transfer should occur during what she termed a period of personal transition in your life. She seemed to believe that timing would be crucial to your ability to use these resources effectively. The phrase personal transition suggested Cordelia had somehow anticipated my marital difficulties, though Harrison couldn't or wouldn't elaborate on what information she might have possessed. What he could tell me was that the estate transfer would be completed within 10 days, making me one of the wealthiest individuals in New England at exactly the moment when Derek believed he was systematically destroying my financial position. Over the following week, as estate documents were prepared and assets transferred, I experienced a psychological shift that went far beyond the obvious implications of sudden wealth. For the first time in years, I felt the return of something I hadn't realized I had lost: a sense of my own power. Not power over others, which had never interested me, but power to make choices based on my own values rather than external constraints or pressures. The inheritance also provided crucial clarity about my family's true financial position. Through Harrison and the estate documents, I learned that the Carmichael family wealth was far more extensive than I had ever imagined. My modest trust fund had indeed been a test of financial responsibility, and my discretion about money had apparently impressed Cordelia enough to make her believe I could handle genuine wealth without being corrupted by it. But perhaps most importantly, the inheritance gave me something Derek couldn't anticipate or plan around: complete strategic flexibility. With $1.3 billion at my disposal, I could choose any response to his eventual divorce filing, from aggressive legal warfare to calculated indifference. The woman Derek thought he was backing into a corner of dependency and desperation was actually being positioned for absolute freedom. I spent considerable time during those 10 days thinking about how to use this advantage. My first instinct was to confront Derek immediately, to reveal the inheritance and watch his carefully constructed strategy crumble in real time. But something held me back. Perhaps the influence of Cordelia's example, her understanding that true power often worked best when it remained invisible until the crucial moment. Instead, I decided to accelerate my own preparations while maintaining complete secrecy about the inheritance. If Derek was planning a multi-year campaign to isolate and financially destroy me, I would use that timeline to my advantage, allowing him to believe his strategy was succeeding while I prepared for a revelation that would make his victory meaningless. The inheritance also provided resources to enhance my intelligence-gathering capabilities. Through Harrison's firm, I hired a discreet investigation service that specialized in financial forensics. Within 2 weeks, I had a comprehensive analysis of Derek's asset movements, offshore account structures, and the full scope of his systematic wealth transfer activities. The report confirmed what I had suspected. Derek had been even more thorough in his planning than I had realized, moving nearly 60% of our marital assets into structures that would be difficult for me to claim in a conventional divorce proceeding.
More importantly,
the investigators uncovered information that Derek himself didn't possess. Detailed financial records showing that my family's wealth was far more substantial than his research had revealed. The Carmichael Financial Network included trust structures, real estate holdings, and investment vehicles that dated back generations, creating a foundation that made Derek's carefully accumulated wealth look modest by comparison. Armed with this information, I began accelerating my own strategic preparations. The art consulting work that had provided modest income became a much more serious enterprise as I leveraged my inheritance to acquire pieces for authentication and resale, building both expertise and financial credibility that existed completely outside Derek's awareness. I also began making strategic connections within Derek's own professional network, attending industry events and social gatherings where I could observe his behavior while building relationships with people who might prove valuable when the inevitable confrontation occurred. Derek, still confident in his timeline and assessment of my capabilities, encouraged this increased social activity as evidence that I was adapting to my proper role as a supportive spouse. The most significant acceleration came in my relationship with Dr. Hartwell and the broader art authentication community. With substantial financial resources at my disposal, I was able to take on projects that enhanced my professional reputation while creating a network of accomplished women who understood both the art world and the broader dynamics of wealth and power. These relationships provided something invaluable: examples of women who had navigated complex financial situations and emerged stronger. As the months passed and Derek's divorce timeline approached, I found myself in an extraordinary position. He believed he was maneuvering against a financially vulnerable woman with limited resources and even more limited understanding of her true situation. In reality, he was targeting someone who not only possessed resources that dwarfed his own, but who had spent over a year studying his methods, documenting his strategies, and preparing for exactly the kind of legal and financial assault he was planning. The woman Derek thought he was systematically weakening had actually become more powerful than she had ever been in her life. And soon, very soon, he would discover that his perfect plan had been built on a foundation of assumptions that weren't just wrong, they were catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. But the beauty of my position was that Derek would only realize his mistake after it was too late to adjust his strategy, after he had already committed to a course of action that would reveal exactly who he was, while simultaneously destroying any chance he might have had to benefit from the wealth that had been hiding in plain sight throughout our entire marriage. The moment Derek's legal team served me with divorce papers, I knew exactly kind of game he thought we were playing. The documents arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who seemed to take particular satisfaction in catching me supposedly unprepared at our Willowbrook Heights home. Derek had clearly instructed his team to serve the papers when he would be safely at his office, avoiding any immediate emotional confrontation that might complicate his narrative of calm, strategic decision-making. What Derek didn't know was that I had been expecting this moment for over 18 months. My forensics team had detected increased activity in his legal consultations 3 weeks earlier, and Harrison Pembroke's contacts in the legal community had confirmed that Derek's attorney, the notorious Marcus Whitmore, had been preparing comprehensive divorce filings for a high-net-worth client matching Derek's description. I accepted the papers with exactly the kind of shocked confusion Derek's team would report back to him. The performance was crucial. Derek needed to believe that his surprise attack had achieved its intended psychological impact. While the process server documented my apparent distress, I was actually analyzing the legal strategy reflected in the filing itself, looking for weaknesses and opportunities that Derek's confidence might have created. The settlement terms were even more vindictive than I had anticipated. Derek wasn't just claiming the majority of our marital assets, he was systematically attempting to leave me with nothing substantial enough to rebuild independently. The filing characterized my contributions to our marriage as minimal and largely social, dismissing my professional background and family connections as irrelevant to wealth accumulation. Most tellingly, Derek's legal team had clearly researched my family's finances and concluded that I had no significant independent resources to draw upon. This last miscalculation was where Derek's strategy would ultimately collapse, but I wasn't ready to reveal that advantage yet. Instead, I spent the first week after being served playing exactly the role Derek expected, a devastated woman scrambling to find legal representation and understand her suddenly precarious position. I hired Jennifer Morrison, a competent but not particularly aggressive divorce attorney whose reputation suggested she would provide adequate representation without threatening Derek's perception of his overwhelming advantage. During our initial meetings, I carefully portrayed myself as someone who had been blindsided by Derek's filing and was struggling to understand the complex financial structures he had created. I just don't understand how we went from being partners to this, I told Jennifer during our second meeting, allowing genuine emotion to color my voice while strategically omitting any mention of my inheritance or the intelligence I had gathered about Derek's activities. Jennifer's assessment of our position was exactly what Derek would expect to hear through the legal community's informal networks. His strategic preparation had been thorough, my resources were limited, and any attempt to challenge his asset allocation would be expensive and probably unsuccessful. This narrative would reinforce Derek's confidence and prevent him from becoming more cautious about his approach.
Meanwhile, I was executing a parallel strategy that existed completely outside the official legal proceedings. Using resources from my inheritance, I retained Blackstone Investigative Services, the most sophisticated financial intelligence firm on the East Coast. Their assignment was simple: compile a comprehensive analysis of Derek's complete financial picture, including assets he had attempted to hide, offshore structures he thought were secure, and, most importantly, any vulnerabilities in his wealth protection strategies. The Blackstone report, delivered just 10 days after Derek filed for divorce, was devastating. Derek had indeed been methodical in moving assets beyond my apparent reach, but his very thoroughness had created a detailed trail of financial maneuvers that could be used against him. More damaging, the investigation revealed that several of Derek's asset protection strategies involved questionable legal techniques that could expose him to regulatory scrutiny if they became public. But the most explosive discovery was Derek's systematic underreporting of income to minimize potential alimony obligations. The discrepancies between his declared earnings and his actual financial activity suggested tax evasion that could result in criminal charges if properly documented and reported to appropriate authorities. Armed with this information, I began the delicate process of positioning Derek for a revelation that would destroy not just his divorce strategy, but potentially his entire professional reputation. The key was timing. I needed Derek to commit fully to his current approach before introducing information that would make his position untenable.
My first tactical move was surprisingly simple. I began asking Derek's attorney for financial documentation that Derek thought I couldn't understand or effectively use. Through Jennifer, I requested detailed accountings of assets, investment structures, and business relationships. To Derek, these requests would seem like desperate fishing expeditions by someone who didn't understand what she was looking for. In reality, each request was designed to force Derek to commit to specific claims about asset ownership and value. Every sworn statement he made in response to my discovery requests would later become evidence of deliberate misrepresentation when the full truth about his financial maneuvers was revealed. Derek's responses to these requests revealed something crucial about his psychology. He couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority. His filings included elaborate explanations of complex financial structures, detailed justifications for various asset transfers, and condescending language that painted me as someone too naive to understand sophisticated wealth management. This need to educate me about my own supposed ignorance was Derek's greatest weakness. Each detailed explanation provided more evidence of his systematic planning and deliberate intent to disadvantage me. More importantly, his tone and approach were creating a documentary record that would be devastating to his reputation if it ever became public. 3 weeks after the initial filing, I decided to introduce the first element of uncertainty into Derek's perfectly ordered strategy. Through Jennifer, I filed a motion requesting that Derek provide documentation about all offshore accounts and foreign financial relationships. The request was carefully worded to suggest that I had obtained incomplete information from an undisclosed source, creating the impression that someone with knowledge of Derek's activities might be cooperating with my legal team. Derek's response was immediate and telling. Within 48 hours, he requested an emergency meeting with Jennifer and me, ostensibly to clarify any misunderstandings about his financial affairs. The urgency of his reaction confirmed that my request had struck a nerve, suggesting vulnerabilities in his offshore structures that he was desperate to protect. The meeting took place in Jennifer's conference room, with Derek accompanied by Marcus Whitmore and his brother Cameron. Derek's body language was markedly different from his usual confident demeanor. Tension in his shoulders, frequent glances at his legal team, and unusual hesitancy in his responses to direct questions. "Natasha," Derek began, using a tone that attempted to be conciliatory but came across as condescending. "I think there may be some misunderstandings about certain business arrangements. Perhaps we could discuss this privately and avoid unnecessary complications." This was the moment I had been preparing for during 18 months of strategic planning. Derek was offering to negotiate, which meant he was acknowledging that his position wasn't as inassailable as he had initially believed. More importantly, his willingness to meet suggested that he was beginning to question what I might know about his activities. "I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully, "but I think it's important that we handle everything through proper legal channels. After all, we want to make sure we're both completely transparent about our respective positions." The word transparent was deliberately chosen. Derek's slight wince when I used it confirmed that he understood the potential implications of genuine transparency about his financial affairs. As the meeting concluded with no concrete resolution, I could see the first cracks appearing in Derek's supreme confidence. He was still certain he would ultimately prevail, but he was no longer certain that his victory would be as clean and decisive as he had originally planned. What Derek couldn't know was that this uncertainty was exactly what I needed to position him for the revelation that would transform our entire dynamic. He was beginning to question his assumptions about my knowledge and capabilities, but he hadn't yet imagined the true scope of what he didn't know about the woman he had spent over a decade underestimating. The unraveling of Derek's carefully constructed world began exactly 72 hours after his divorce papers were finalized, though he wouldn't understand the connection for several more days. I had spent those 3 days in deliberate silence, allowing Derek to believe that his legal victory was complete and his financial strategy had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections. He had taken everything visible, claimed everything valuable, and left me with what he calculated to be just enough resources to survive quietly without causing him further complications.
What Derek experienced first was not dramatic revelation, but subtle wrongness, small deviations from expected patterns that accumulated into nagging uncertainty. It began with a phone call from his private banker at Meridian Trust, the exclusive financial institution that managed the Westfield family's wealth and had helped structure many of Derek's asset protection strategies. Mr. Westfield, the banker said during what should have been a routine quarterly review, we've received some inquiries from regulatory agencies regarding certain offshore structures associated with your accounts. Nothing urgent, but we wanted to make you aware that additional documentation may be required in the coming weeks. Derek's response was controlled but concerned. These structures had been designed specifically to avoid regulatory attention, and inquiries suggested that someone with detailed knowledge of his financial arrangements had drawn official scrutiny to precisely the areas he most needed to keep private. The timing, just days after his divorce was finalized, couldn't be coincidental. The second indication that something fundamental had shifted came through his professional network. Derek's reputation in the investment banking community was built on his image as someone who made calculated, successful decisions in both business and personal affairs. The divorce had been presented to his colleagues as a strategic move, a necessary correction that would enhance rather than complicate his financial position. But whispers began circulating through the exclusive clubs and private dining rooms where Derek's social circle conducted their most sensitive business. The conversations were subtle, indirect, but their cumulative effect was unmistakable. Questions about Derek's judgment, concerns about potential complications from his personal affairs, suggestions that perhaps his divorce strategy hadn't been as clean and decisive as he had portrayed. Marcus Whitmar, Derek's attorney, received the first concrete indication that their assumptions about my resources and capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. A letter arrived at his office from Harrison Pembroke's firm, not threatening or aggressive, but inquiring about the possibility of clarifying certain financial disclosures that appeared to have been incomplete during the divorce proceedings. The letter included no specific allegations, but its implications were devastating. It suggested that I had access to legal representation of a caliber that Marcus himself respected, and more importantly, that this representation believed there were grounds to challenge the completeness and accuracy of Derek's financial disclosures. Marcus immediately contacted Derek, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss potential complications that had emerged following the finalization of their divorce settlement. The urgency in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, and Derek understood that something significant had changed in a situation he thought was permanently resolved. The meeting took place the following morning in Marcus's corner office, with Cameron present via video conference from his forensic accounting firm. Derek arrived expecting to address minor procedural issues, but Marcus's opening statement shattered that assumption. "Derek, we may have a problem. Natasha appears to have retained Pembroke, Sterling, and Associates, and they're asking questions that suggest she has access to information about your financial arrangements that we didn't anticipate." Cameron's response was immediate and alarmed. "That's impossible. Our research was comprehensive. Natasha doesn't have the resources to retain a firm like Pembroke, and even if she did, there's no way she could have obtained detailed information about the offshore structures." But the evidence suggested otherwise. Over the following week, additional inquiries arrived from various sources,
each precisely targeted at the most vulnerable aspects of Derek's financial strategy. Banking regulators wanted clarification about certain international transfers. Tax authorities requested documentation about business expenses that had been used to justify personal asset acquisitions. Professional licensing boards began reviewing complaints about ethical violations in client relationships. None of these inquiries mentioned my name directly, and none could be traced to any action I had taken personally, but their timing, specificity, and coordination suggested a level of strategic planning that Derek had never imagined I possessed. More troubling, the questions being asked demonstrated knowledge of financial details that Derek thought were known only to himself and his most trusted advisors. The social consequences accelerated in parallel with the regulatory scrutiny. Derek's mother, Patricia, who had been so vocal in celebrating his divorce victory, began receiving polite but pointed questions from her social circle about certain rumors regarding her son's business practices. The questions weren't accusatory, but they carried the subtle poison of doubt that could destroy reputations in their rarefied social environment. Derek's professional relationships began experiencing similar strain. Clients who had been scheduled to increase their investment allocations with his firm suddenly requested delays for additional due diligence. Colleagues who had congratulated him on his successful divorce settlement now seemed uncomfortable discussing his personal affairs. Invitations to exclusive events became less frequent, then stopped entirely. The most devastating blow came when Derek's largest client, the Pemberton Family Trust, requested a meeting to discuss concerns about recent developments that might affect their continued professional relationship. The Pemberton account represented nearly 30% of Derek's annual commission income, and its loss would significantly impact his both professional standing and personal financial position. During that meeting, conducted in the austere conference room of the Pemberton family's private office, Derek learned that they had received informal inquiries about his business practices from sources they declined to identify. While no specific allegations had been made, the family's risk management protocols required them to reassess any professional relationships that might expose them to reputational damage. "You understand," the family's representative explained, with the cold politeness of old money dispensing with inadequate service providers, that our primary obligation is protecting the family's interests. Recent questions about your personal financial arrangements suggest complexities that might not align with our preference for straightforward, transparent business relationships.
Derek left that meeting understanding that his professional reputation was being systematically dismantled by forces he couldn't identify or combat. The attack was too sophisticated to be coincidental, too precisely targeted to be based on general suspicion, too well coordinated to be the work of someone without substantial resources and expertise. That evening, as Derek sat in the mansion he had fought so hard to keep, surrounded by the art collection he had claimed and the luxury items he had successfully retained, he began to understand that his victory might have been Pyrrhic. The assets he had acquired were becoming liabilities, as their ownership drew unwanted attention to financial maneuvers he had hoped would remain invisible. The final realization came when Derek received a call from his brother Cameron, whose forensic accounting firm had been contacted by potential clients requesting background checks on Derek's financial integrity. Cameron's business depended on his reputation for discretion and accuracy, and association with Derek was beginning to affect his own professional relationships. "Derek," Cameron said, his voice strained with a combination of anger and fear, "whatever you did, whatever you missed about Natasha's situation, it's destroying both of us. My firm has lost 3 clients this week because of questions about my involvement in your divorce strategy." As Derek ended that call, he faced a truth that his arrogance had made impossible to anticipate. The woman he had systematically underestimated, financially isolated, and legally outmaneuvered had somehow orchestrated consequences that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build.
His perfect plan had not just failed, it had backfired with a precision that suggested intelligence, resources, and strategic thinking far beyond anything he had imagined possible. The divorce papers that had represented his complete victory were beginning to feel like evidence of the greatest miscalculation of his life. And somewhere in the city, the woman he thought he had defeated was positioning herself to reveal exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. The final revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a simple newspaper announcement that appeared in the Millfield County Business Journal on a quiet Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Derek's world had begun its systematic collapse. The headline was understated, almost modest. Local woman named to Forbes billionaires list following major inheritance. Derek was having coffee in his kitchen, still wearing the custom suits and living in the mansion he had fought so hard to retain, when he saw my photograph accompanying an article that would shatter every assumption he had built his strategy upon. The article described how Natasha Carmichael, they used my maiden name, had inherited $1.3 billion from her great-aunt Cordelia Ashworth, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in New England overnight. What made the article particularly devastating was its timing details. The inheritance had been finalized just 2 days after our divorce was complete, meaning that for exactly 72 hours, Derek had believed himself the victor in a battle against a woman who was already worth more than his family had accumulated across 3 generations of careful wealth management. The newspaper's financial writer had clearly done thorough research, describing Cordelia Ashworth as a reclusive investment genius whose early positions in technology companies and energy sectors had generated returns that redefined the possibilities of strategic wealth building. The article noted that the inheritance included not just liquid assets, but controlling interests in several companies whose names Derek recognized from his own investment research. Companies he had considered beyond the reach of individual investors. But the most humiliating detail was buried in the article's final paragraphs, a quote from Harrison Pembroke confirming that the inheritance had been planned for several years and that Cordelia had been monitoring her great-niece's personal circumstances to ensure optimal timing for the wealth transfer. The implication was clear. Cordelia had known about our marital difficulties and had specifically structured the inheritance to provide me with maximum leverage at exactly the moment Derek thought he was destroying my financial position. Derek's immediate response was to call Marcus Whitmore, demanding an emergency meeting to discuss the new information and its implications for their divorce settlement. But Marcus's secretary informed him that Mr. Whitmore was unavailable and that any future communications should be directed through junior associates. The message was unmistakable. Marcus was distancing himself from Derek and the professional liability his association represented. Over the following days, as the news of my inheritance spread through our former social circles, Derek experienced the complete inversion of his social and professional position. The same people who had congratulated him on his strategic divorce now viewed him as the man who had thrown away a billionaire wife. His calculated victory became a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the importance of understanding what you're actually fighting for. The business consequences accelerated with brutal efficiency. By the end of the week, Derek had lost 4 major clients and had been formally placed on administrative review by his firm's executive committee. The regulatory inquiries that seemed mysterious when they began now had obvious explanations. My resources had enabled investigations that Derek's modest wealth could never have afforded or withstood. But the most profound change wasn't in Derek's circumstances. It was in my own transformation. The woman who had spent 12 years trying to be the perfect wife, who had compromised her career and diminished her ambitions to support Derek's vision of our life together, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood that true power came not from accumulating assets, but from the wisdom to use resources in alignment with authentic values. The inheritance had provided financial freedom, but the real liberation had come from seeing Derek's character with complete clarity. The man I had loved was revealed to be someone who viewed relationships as transactions, who measured worth by control, and who could only conceive of victory in terms of someone else's defeat. Understanding this truth hadn't just freed me from Derek, it had freed me from the version of myself that had enabled his treatment. Within 6 months of receiving the inheritance, I had established the Cordelia Ashworth Foundation, focusing on supporting women who were navigating difficult life transitions. The foundation's mission was personal, ensuring that other women would have the resources and support to recognize their own worth before circumstances forced that recognition upon them. I also returned to the art world, but with a perspective that my previous career had lacked. With substantial resources and complete independence, I could pursue authentication projects based on their historical significance rather than their commercial value. The Carmichael Institute for Art Historical Research became one of the most respected institutions in its field, attracting scholars and preserving works that might otherwise have been lost to private collections or inadequate preservation. My personal life underwent an equally profound transformation. The social circle Derek and I had maintained, relationships built on professional networking and social positioning, fell away naturally, replaced by connections based on shared interests and genuine compatibility. For the first time in years, I formed friendships with people who knew nothing about my wealth and cared even less about my former marriage. The most unexpected development was my relationship with Harrison Pembroke's son, Dr. Michael Pembroke, a professor of art history at Harvard who shared my passion for Renaissance painting and had never shown the slightest interest in my financial circumstances. Our relationship developed slowly, built on intellectual compatibility and mutual respect, rather than the strategic considerations that had characterized my marriage to Derek. 6 months after the divorce, I moved from my studio apartment into a restored 19th century townhouse in Boston's Back Bay, chosen not for its prestige, but for its proximity to the museums and galleries where I spent most of my time. The house was elegant but comfortable, decorated with pieces from my own collection rather than items selected for their impressive value or social significance. Derek, meanwhile, had been forced to sell the Willowbrook Heights mansion when his professional income proved insufficient to maintain it, without the expense accounts and client entertainment budgets his firm had revoked. The art collection he had fought to retain was liquidated to cover legal fees and regulatory fines that continued to accumulate as investigations into his financial practices proceeded. The most satisfying aspect of Derek's downfall wasn't his financial losses, though the irony of his situation was undeniable, but his complete loss of the social standing he had valued above everything else. The man who measured worth by status and influence found himself professionally radioactive and socially irrelevant, unable to rebuild relationships he had treated as transactional conveniences. As I sat in my Boston study one evening, exactly 1 year after Derek had filed for divorce, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed the worst betrayal of my life into the foundation for genuine happiness. The inheritance had provided resources, but the real gift had been clarity about Derek's character, about my own values, and about the difference between apparent success and authentic fulfillment. Derek had taken everything in our divorce, believing he was claiming the spoils of strategic victory. What he had actually done was free me from a life built on compromises I should never have made with a person who had never deserved the trust I had given him. His perfect plan had indeed succeeded, just not in the way he had intended. Sometimes the universe has its own sense of timing and justice. Derek had spent years positioning himself to win a game he didn't understand against an opponent he had completely underestimated. His victory had lasted exactly 72 hours, long enough to savor what he thought he had accomplished, short enough to make the reversal absolutely devastating. The woman Derek had dismissed as financially naive and emotionally dependent was now one of the most influential philanthropists in New England, using resources he couldn't have imagined to pursue goals he couldn't have comprehended. And the man who had congratulated himself on his strategic brilliance was learning that true intelligence isn't about taking everything you can. It's about recognizing what's actually worth having. In the end, Derek had gotten exactly what he deserved, a life that reflected his values perfectly. The only problem was that his values, when expressed without compromise or disguise, had created a world that nobody, including Derek, actually wanted to inhabit. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.